kind of get the recording started and we can start in earnest.
Sure, no worries.
Yeah.
Alex should be joining us in any second.
Yeah, cool. So today, writers, in case you do not know, our topic is about writers' rooms, being inside writers' rooms, how they work, what they are, why they work the way they do. So if you're not here for that, now is the time to log off and find the session you actually want. You guys can't see it, but Joey is sitting right over here and he's cackling at me. He thinks it's hilarious. But why don't I have you gentlemen introduce yourself and then we can get going.
All right, sounds good. So my name is Nick. Are we still on? Okay. Yeah. So my name is Nick Watson. I am a TV comedy writer. Most recently, I was a staff writer on season 2 of Final Space, the animated sitcom for TBS. Before that, I was freelancing on some kids animation, a show called Littlest Pet Shop for Hasbro and Discovery Family. And before that, I did a whole bunch of different things, creative exec at a management and production company. I worked in physical production on shows like The Muppets and Criminal Minds and a whole bunch of other things. So, and I've been in LA for a little over 3 years now. I'm from Australia originally. My accent's kind of gone away. So
You have an accent. What? I'm Alex Freeman. I occupy the 1 hour / TV drama space. I'm originally from Paris, which is why I also have an accent. And I moved to the States about 8 years ago. I won my green card, the lottery. I'm one of those lucky people. And since then, I've worked in TV in various capacities, first in development at Epix. And then I worked on Hell on Wheels, the AMC show, and Falling Skies, the TNT show. And I just finished working on the second season of the Netflix sci-fi show Altered Carbon.
Super cool. And I absolutely do not believe you when you tell me you're from Paris because your English is perfect.
I could speak like this the entire webinar.
Please do for the rest of the webinar. That's the new rule. All right, cool. Well, I figure it's best to probably kick this off with addressing what is the purpose of a writer's room? Why even have one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that I guess you have to realize that making a TV show is a huge undertaking, and it's not possible really to do that all by yourself, especially on the creative level. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. There are some people who sit down and write an entire 6 episodes of a season or something. A lot of the British shows do that, but the traditional model is to have a large group of writers that's being headed up by a showrunner who's kind of the creative vision of that. And so they will hire a team of writers from different levels of experience, other very experienced writers, some newer writers. And then there might be anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 other writers in the room with them. And their entire job is essentially coming up with the stories and then turning those into documents that can do stuff with outlines, scripts, that kind of thing.
Right. And to Nick's point, I mean, TV is quite different from, let's say, feature, where in feature you only have to produce essentially 90 to 120 pages of content, whereas in TV you have to sometimes you have to do 22 episodes of a 1 hour show, which equals 60 pages. So imagine, 22 times 60 page in a single year. That's a huge amount of content. So that's why you also need that room of writers to not only generate idea after idea after idea, but also to generate that content on the page.
Nice. I love it. Okay, so we've got our writer's room. We've established that we do probably need one, and this is a good idea to have one. Now the question is, what are the different roles in the writer's room? Who's who, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so just starting from, let's say, the top down, you have essentially your showrunner, or usually is the creator of the show. Sometimes if it's a newer person who created the show, then they're going to bring in a showrunner with more producing experience, because essentially that position is the equivalent of being the CEO to a multi-million-dollar company. Because what most people don't realize about that position is it isn't just about being a super writer, so to speak, with all the creative abilities. It's also about managing on the production scale, everything from the top down. So that's a key position to look out for. And then underneath, usually most genres and most rooms have a number two, which is a producer, usually an executive producer with equal, if not slightly below experience, who will help run the room, run the writer's room, and help the writers come up with ideas while the showrunner is busy doing all these other production tasks. And then you have, your co-APs who are also involved in the breaking of the story and sometimes the production. And then you have sort of that mid-level tier. I don't know if Nick can
Right.
talk
Yeah,
to.
those are all of yours. So after your co-executive producers, you go down the next level, and you've got people like, what is it after that? Supervising producers, or
Right.
Yeah, supervising producers. And then sometimes those can be kind of consultants that they bring in. They're not always people who are there 5 days a week in the room. They can be, say, someone who is very experienced and run a lot of genre shows before, but they're busy developing or something like that. So we'll have them in 1 or 2 days a week, or they might bring in a writer like that to supervise on set and hang out while they're filming and be the kind of the showrunner's eyes and ears on the set as well. So and then you keep working your way down those mid levels. You get stuff like just regular producer level writers, co-producer, down to kind of executive story editor down to the staff writers, which are usually the entry level kind of writing jobs in a room, which is what a lot of people are striving to get to.
Absolutely. And a lot of the rooms, and again, it depends on the show you're talking about, but a lot of rooms by and large are top heavy, which means that they have a lot of those higher level positions. And because those people are the most expensive, because they have the most experience, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, the staff writer or even the story editors are going to be the last people staffed because they're the cheapest. And at that point, in terms of the budget of the show and budget of the room, that showrunner and those EPs only have a few dollars essentially to purchase or rent out a staff writer.
Yeah, and the expectations of all those different levels of writers are according to their rank
Right.
and how much they're paid. So when you come in as a staff writer on a lot of shows, there isn't the expectation that you're always going to be right off the bat pitching out a million ideas, writing a bunch of episodes for the show. Often you're there to learn, at least for the first year. And so, maybe once or twice per day, you might chime in with a little idea that helps someone out. And if you're lucky, you might get assigned one script. You might be co-writing a script that season, whereas the higher level writers are taking multiple scripts, or they're really doing the bulk of the talking and the discussion in the room. And you should be kind of deferring to them when you are one of those lower level writers.
All right, cool. So let's say if somebody is, aspires to level staff writer, writer's assistant, story editor, what have you. What are some important skills that people should have to develop in order to A, get into the room, and then B, succeed in the room?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of people, that is the path that they take towards getting staffed, is joining as a member of the support staff, whether that is a writer's PA, who's the kind of person who will usually get lunch and coffees for the writers. They'll hang out, they'll, make sure the office is stocked and do any kind of little runs and tasks that they need. It's like a regular PA, except you're assigned solely to the writers and you're kind of making sure that they're looked after. You can also be a writer's assistant, which is a little more hands-on. You're in the room, you're taking notes from what everyone's talking about the story, you're typing up those notes, you're sending them out to people, you're keeping track of a number of more creatively involved things. And then there's also script coordinators, which is another kind of level of technical skill, again, where you're really keeping track of each of the different drafts of the scripts and making sure that production has the correct draft to go and shoot, and all the changes that come through, you're republishing those, all that kind of thing. So it's very common for people to work their way up into the writer's room through these positions. And I guess in terms of the skills that would make that valuable, what are your thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of I'll just start quickly on the script coordinating side, which I feel is probably the most technical position of all of them. So that's probably the hardest position to have, because you are in the middle of all these different departments, tracking continuity and tracking a lot of production elements. So that's probably the hardest job to do and to get also. And most people I know who are script coordinators became script coordinators because they were trained under another script coordinator when they were just a writer's PA or writer's assistant.
Yeah, you really need like a good level of understanding of how production works to be a script coordinator. You can't come in off the street. The entry level job closest to a writer's room might be something like a writer's PA, because anyone can go get lunches and coffees and whatever, but these jobs require more skills and experience.
Absolutely. And I think the key element they want to mention is that a lot of people think being a writer's assistant is an entry level position, when in fact it is not. Like Nick said, writer's PA is probably the closest to an entry position job that there is on staff, and that's because, to be honest, the tasks you need to do are pretty straightforward. However, you can also show that you're willing to do more on the job, especially if you're writer's PA, volunteering to help out the writer's assistant, volunteering to maybe track the story or character arcs, whatever is needed by the writers. I think taking stuff off the back of the writer's assistant is always a good way to indicate that not only are you, a good potential writer down the line, but also you're a good team player.
Yeah, I think that's a useful skill to have for people in those kind of positions. I think just realizing that no job is below you, even if it's rearranging the LaCroix cans in the fridge to be color coordinated or something like that, showing that you're eager and excited and passionate to be there and really putting in the extra miles and the effort. And people will notice that. And then maybe when an opportunity does come up to move up to writer's assistant or to fill in for them one day in the room, then people are going to be like, well, this person's really been putting in that work. So I think above all else, just, the willingness to go above and beyond is a very important skill for those kind of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on the writer's assistant side quickly, I feel like the writer's assistant is one of the toughest jobs to do, specifically because you're going to be in the room for, maybe 10 hours a day, if not more, transcribing those notes and transcribing what people say. But I think the difficult element is being cognizant of what needs to be in the document at the end of the day, because you may have, I don't know how many pages in that document after a whole day of talking, but you got to go home and then you're going to edit that document so that's legible and useful for the writers, because it's not just about transcribing, it's also about having a brain, so to speak, and being actively listening throughout the day and understanding where do people land on in terms of story ideas, as well as what people will need down the line.
Yeah, and I think across the board, just keeping that in mind, what can I do that is going to make things easier for other people? Even if you're a staff writer, you're looking to, riff off of ideas that other people are having and offering some new idea or solution. You never want to be that person who's throwing a stick in the mud or a spanner in the works and saying, oh, no, I don't think that story is going to work. No, that was a bad pitch. That was a bad joke, things like that. Just being kind of positive and doing that improv yes and thing and just trying to build and make yourself valuable and useful in the room.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. So we started getting into this a little bit there at the end, which is perfect because now we can segue. So let's say, our imaginary person is a writer, has been staffed, it's their first day, it's their first season, whatever it is. What are some things that they can expect from, their first position in the room?
Yeah, so I would say that, first of all, it's hard to give like an evergreen statement about the first day in a room because every show is going to be different. However, to that point, I feel like that first day and that first week, as a staff writer or as a person on the lowest on the totem pole, I would argue that you should be listening instead of talking. You should be feeling out what the etiquette of the room, what the politics of the room are. Maybe some people have worked with other people. Maybe it's a brand new room. Whatever the case may be, I feel like you need to tread carefully initially and test the waters and see, okay, when should I be pitching? Or, when should I be just sitting down, shutting up and listening to what is around me?
Yeah, I think especially in your first writing job, you're going to come in, you're going to be really excited, you're going to be full of ideas on what you want to do in the show and how you can be valuable to people. But you do just have to take it a little bit easy and let the people who are running the room run the room. And like we were saying before, try to add to that and contribute and not dominate the discussion and that kind of thing. But again, like Alex said, it is a case-by-case basis. There are rooms that are 12 writers, and so you might get to talk once or twice a day if you're the lowest rung on the totem pole. And then there are rooms that are 4 or 5 writers, and in that case, they might really need you to be pitching in and contributing and that kind of thing. So it's just feeling it out and getting a sense of the room, especially like Alex said in that first week, understanding what is expected of each of the people and the politics and the dynamics and the things that are going on there.
Yeah, and that tone is usually set by the higher levels, like whether it's the showrunner or the number 2. And so some shows will have that very strict hierarchy where, if you're a noob staff writer, you're not expected to talk at all. Whereas some rooms, as Nick mentioned, if it's just like 5 or 6 people, you're in that room for a reason. So you are expected to contribute in some capacity. So it really depends on not just the show, but again, the makeup of the room and the willingness of the showrunner to listen also.
All right, great. So, excluding, of course, specifics to different rooms, different show writers, different shows, are there some general conduct rules that people should be following in addition to being a decent human being?
Right. Well, I feel like being a decent human being is probably the hardest thing to do. No. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to like quantify exactly in terms of the room etiquette, but like Nick mentioned, the whole yes and of it all. I feel like building on pitches is probably one of the most difficult, but also crucial skills to have in the room, because a lot of people, myself included, have the tendency to negatively react or be critical about other people's pitches, especially when you find, holes in the logic of it or the story or whatever. But the reality is that no story is perfect when you pitch it, right? Like that's the point of a writer's room, is people building on top of ideas on top of ideas. It's kind of like making, a Lego set or any kind of a building block construction.
Right. Yeah. You don't want people to be afraid of throwing out, quote unquote, bad pitches, because often those are the things that, even though they seem ridiculous or, like they might not work on the face of it, they can tick over an idea in someone's head and go, wait, actually, there's something about that if we did this with this other thing, and that might end up finding a solution. So instead of everyone sitting around quietly, like pulling out their hair going, oh, how do we fix this? Sometimes people just start riffing on, like, what if we did X, Y? I know this is dumb. Here's a bad pitch, but X, Y, Z. And then going through that process just allows you to kind of brainstorm and get all of that stuff out and find the way through. So you never want to be that person, someone throws out this bad idea and they're like, oh yeah, that's dumb, that's not going to work. Like that's going to really not put you in a good light with the other writers.
Yeah, at some point, like you said, you got to let it suck in the room. You got to let it meander for a second. And when you're the one pitching, I feel like a lot of people withhold their pitches because they want to express their ideas in this perfect, bulletproof way. But the reality is, again, like any pitch you're going to be making is not bulletproof. So don't be afraid if you do have an interesting idea that contributes to the conversation to pitch it. Because a lot of newer writers are on the other scale of things. They're too afraid to speak. And so you got to find that middle ground.
Yeah, and there's one thing that kind of will frustrate me in a room when people are pitching too, and that's when other writers will cut someone off when they're in the middle of pitching. Someone starts talking about their great idea, and then someone comes in. It's probably, it's harmless. They're excited about it too, and they're like, oh yeah, and then what if this and this, or they take it in some other direction, but that might not have been what that writer was trying to say. And it's kind of rude to just like stop them in the middle of their idea and talk over them and take over from them. So I think like let people do their pitch, hear them out, and then chime in with your thoughts. Take a minute to think about it rather than assuming you know what they're going to say or thinking you have a better idea to build on top of. Like let people have their time in the spotlight.
Yeah, I would say another element to watch out for if you're newer in the room is to learn the lingo of the room and mimic whatever terms or metaphors they like to use. I feel like writers' rooms especially have very special vocabulary that they use. And so if you not only learn what that is, but also inject it in your own speech, in the way you pitch, there's my accent, in the way you pitch your stories, I feel like you're going to be part of the room. I guess that's like a basic like sociological concept, but it holds true within the writer's room between 12 people is, if there's an inside joke or if the way they pitch it, they use, oh, it's like the shape of this thing, whatever. And then everybody starts using shape of or whatever it is, imitating and being part of that environment definitely helps.
Cool. I love it. All right. So let's say this hypothetical writer, staff writer, they're in the room, they've learned the conduct, they haven't offended anybody or put their foot in their mouth too much yet. So what is the process for, breaking out a season or a series? How do they plan what they're going to do and assign episodes, jobs, etc.?
No, sure. So in the first kind of, couple of days to weeks, there's often this process of what they call blue skying. And that's because it's basically just these big, broad ideas. Like you've got an entirely blue open sky and you could throw anything you want up there and let's see what sticks and see what happens. So there'll be a bit of that. I mean, depending on the timeline for the room and the constraints of production and how much the showrunner creator came in with already in mind, there's usually that kind of process of just like throw out your big ideas and themes and characters and see what we can do with it. So that's the place it tends to start.
Yeah, and I guess for comedy, maybe it's a little bit different, but in drama, that's going to be a few weeks of time because, as you just mentioned, the showrunner and the creator usually comes in the room, hopefully with some idea of the different tent poles they want to hit. And depending on the framework of the show, if it's like, a 6-episode series versus like a 22-episode season, they will have those different arcs that they want to hit. And so that's a lot of, maybe from the outside in, it looks like a lot of time wasting. But from the inside, it's a lot of it allows the writers to not just think of stories, but really live in that world and live in that environment, coming from something completely different before it.
Yeah, and then so typically you'll move on from there once you kind of gravitated towards some of those big ideas that were thrown out or that were put up by the showrunner, into, I guess, looking at what we call like the macro structure of a season, especially if you're working in drama or serialized comedy. You're really wanting to find what are the big tent poles and the big moments that are going to play out over this season, and it might be one every 3 episodes, or it might be the 3 big things that are going to happen, and they're going to be the big cliffhanger moments or things like that. So you finding those on both story and plot level, and a character level as well in terms of the journeys and where they're ending up.
Yeah, every room, again, it's going to be different. I keep repeating that, but some rooms will look at the character arcs specifically. They want to know, okay, where is Jack starting in the season, and where is he ending at the end, and where does Jill end up connecting with Jack at what point in the season? And some rooms, they like they're more story heavy. They're more based on, okay, what's the cool plot point or the cool twist? That's a lot of those procedurals, but a lot of those, serialized mysteries. I'm sure like How to Get Away with Murder, I don't work in the room, but I know that they work a lot based on whatever that season mystery is, that murder mystery. So it depends. I don't know about comedy though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really, again, we'll say this a million times, but it depends on the comedy. The show that I worked for did have some kind of serialized elements to it, and so we would be looking at character journeys over the season, and then I guess tying it back to some of those big episode ideas we had. It's like, oh, maybe this is where this character has this point in their journey, and that kind of thing. And then trying to interweave the character arcs with the story arcs and the points at which they intersect and how those all kind of relate to each other.
Right. It also depends on if your show is based on an IP. On my show, the fact that we're based on an IP didn't really matter at the end of the day, but it gave us a framework for that world building and that blue sky.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, once you figure out those big tentpole moments, then you typically start breaking it down into either the individual episodes or smaller episode arcs. I know some of the kind of like the CW superhero shows will kind of imitate almost like comic arcs, how they have like a 3 or 6 episode run, and so they're doing these like little mini arcs within that. So that's sometimes a thing within drama, particularly.
Yeah, especially if you are looking at a season that's 20 plus episode a year, you just cannot sustain a one arc of 20 episodes. That doesn't exist. So even if you look at shows like 24, that's like 24 episodes, but traditionally every season of 24 is going to be broken down into 3 main arcs of multiple episodes, and each arc is going to be based around a villain. And that's why in season 7 and 8 it kind of became tropey that, oh wait, the villain from the first half of the season is not actually the main villain. There's a villain behind the villain, and that idea. Now, to go back to the CW example that you mentioned, a lot of those shows base their episodes on what the characters journey is going to be about. So it's not about finding the villain first. It's about finding it's about finding what Barry, for example, on The Flash is going through in that episode. So that's a different way of thinking from your traditional procedural, who are mostly case based and are mostly about finding the fresh off the headline concept that they want to hit.
Yeah, so like depending on whether it is a more procedural or hard reset kind of show, like a Law and Order, or even like The Simpsons, that's kind of a hard reset every week. It doesn't tend to continue any sort of serialization across. It wouldn't really matter where you start breaking your individual episodes, but with some of the more serialized ones, you do probably often start from the start. It's like, all right, what's our episode 1? Then we're going to do our episode 2, 3, and find how that all kind of leads into each other. Or you might have an idea of where you're going to end up as well. So then you get down to that kind of like episodic level, and all of this is just kind of like fractal and granular. It's like, we do the big arcs and then the small arcs and then the episode arcs, and then within that we have 3 plot arcs and 2 character arcs and all that kind of thing. So it just keeps going down and down and down on a smaller level like that.
And then you break the beats of the episode.
Yeah,
that's what you do. And then you look at really what are the interesting scenes and the interesting plot points that you want to hit in that episode. And by and large, if you're on a broadcast network, the main tentpole moments are going to be around the cliffhangers, the outbreaks. And so that's usually where, the skeleton of that puzzle is going to be. It's kind of like when you're filling out the corners before you fill in the middle part of the puzzle. That's usually how episodes are broken.
Yeah, so each show has a certain number of acts that they work to. It might be 2 or 3 acts in a comedy. In drama, it could be anywhere from 4, 5, 7 acts. It really just depends on the show and what you're going towards. Like Alex said, sometimes they are the actual places where ads come in, or for stuff like cable or Netflix, it's more of just a structural thing for the writers. So you're working to these big act break moments that are kind of, these acts are almost like little mini arcs within themselves of plot and character that'll build on each other through to the climax. For us, at least, when I was writing in Final Space, we would be finding each of the act breaks and how does that serve the story and the characters, and where does it leave the audience, and how does it all push us towards this end. And that would be the bigger things we would find first, and then go back and find each of the beats that lead up to those act breaks in each act.
Yeah, on our show is much more serialized and without any ads. So we were looking more so at the character arcs and the story narratives over just what a single episode is going to look like on a granular basis. Obviously, at some point, you do have to break the episode and what that looks like, but it's a lot of pitching and figuring out what the overall shape of the episode is, because we don't have the luxury of having that traditional 5-act structure like on an NBC show.
Yeah. And then so once you have the beats of an individual episode, there are different ways to do it. Some rooms use index cards, and they'll write down a beat and put it up on a board with pins, and they can move them around and change where they want to go. Some of them write them up on a whiteboard instead, and so they'll erase it and move things around that way. And then once you kind of done that and run through it, sometimes, if the showrunner isn't in the room, the showrunner will come in and you'll pitch it to them off of the beats on the index cards or the board, and they'll say, well, change this, and I didn't like that, and that was good. And then you do it again. And once you get that approved, that's when you typically head to the outline for the episode.
All right, just to go back quickly before I go on the outline, the pitching to the showrunner is usually done either by the writer of the episode or by the number 2, whoever's in charge in that room. And in terms of the index cards, sometimes we combine both and we do magnetic tiles. That's the future. But then the writer's assistant's job is to collate that information, either take pictures of the board and put it in the notes documents, or transcribe whatever's on that board and put it in the notes. So whichever one works.
Yeah, and even before that step, depending on your show, you might be coming up with general what they call story areas, which might be a paragraph or something, generally what the episode is going to be about, or it might be a rough outlaying of what the 3 acts of it are going to be. It depends on the show. And then you might send that over to the network and get their general, or the studio and the network, get their general thoughts and feedback on, do we like this as just an idea for an episode? What's the log line for this? Where are we heading in the season?
Yeah, if it's a more hyper-serialized show, usually you're going to be pitching that season arc from the get-go. And so the network usually has an idea more or less of what each episode is going to be about, because you're going to be pitching that season arc and that breakdown. Now, going back to the outline of it all, once you do have those beats and those cards and those moments planned out, then those will be translated into an actual document. Usually that's either the writer's assistant or the script coordinator's job to translate whatever those beats are into an actual final draft outline document. And then the writer is sent to outline, and he or she is going to be writing out and expanding on those beats and writing prose, essentially.
Yeah, so an outline almost looks like a script. It's got your scene headers, interior, car, day, etc., and then there's just like a very short description of what happens in the scene based off of the notes from that you discussed in the room and the beats that you broke in the outline. There might be dialogue pitches, there might be joke pitches, there might be certain big moments that need to happen in that scene, but a lot of the smaller details and the way to work around through that is left up to the writer once they sit down and they start fleshing that outline into the actual first draft of the script.
Yeah.
If you want. Yeah, should we go through like the rest of the drafts through to the finished product?
Well, that was actually going to be my next question, so you read my mind. Let's say, the episode gets drafted. What is kind of the revision process? Does it kind of depend on the show and the episode, I imagine, to some degree?
Yeah, so like you said, it depends on the show and the episode. But
we can just start assuming that from now on.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's like a crutch. I want to reuse that sentence. So once you're past the outline, usually you'll get notes on that, and then you're going to go to draft. And in terms of the assignments of drafts, it's usually by order of a hierarchy. So whoever the higher ups are, they're going to be leading the charge in terms of the EP is going to be writing the first episode or the second episode and so on, and then you go down the line. And that's why staff writers sometimes do not get an episode. That's because there's just not enough episodes for the number of writers in the room. Now, with that said, once you have that draft out, then usually the room is going to comment on it, and there's different levels. I don't know if you want to talk about the different levels of drafts, but essentially you have the writer's draft, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the writer's output of whatever the draft is. She or he is going to send it to the room internally, and usually the showrunner will have comments, and the showrunner is going to give notes, and the EPs are going to give notes on that draft. Now, sometimes the showrunner himself or herself is going to be making those changes, but most of the time it's expected for the writer to be making those changes because the showrunner is busy with all the production elements.
Yeah, I'd say typically once you get those notes back on your first draft, the writer takes one more stab at it, and then they hand it in again, and then anything else that's going to happen internally from there, the showrunner will just take their pass on it. And then once they're happy with that and everything's all good and it's gone through the room and all that kind of thing, it starts to move its way up the kind of production company studio network ladder, and you'll have a different draft at each point. You take it to I'm going to stop saying it depends on the show, but let's say there's a studio network draft, and then so the studio might look at it first and give notes, and then once it's good from that, you take it to the network. That could even be the earlier step of a production company or executive producer who really wants to do a draft of that first. You could have anywhere up to 3 drafts of approval through that process, and then once the studio network are fine with it and we've got that all green lit, that's usually when it goes to your shooting draft,
right? And
just table reads too. Yeah,
table reads. But just before that, in terms of each step of the process, it really depends on how specific the studio or the networks want to be with each draft. Sometimes it can go straight to network if it's all in-house. Most places will want that delineation between a studio draft and a network draft. And in between each of the steps, the script coordinator is going to be looking at that draft and editing it and making sure that there's no grammar mistakes and the continuity is fine and it's all formatted correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so usually before you get your shooting draft, you'll have a table read draft, and that's when they get the actors together, they get the producers and the writers all in a room, and they just sit there and they do kind of like a cold read through the script, and the network and studio and those kind of people will often attend as well and give their thoughts and notes after that table read, and then they'll go back and do another draft, which finally hopefully gets approved to go and shoot.
Yeah.
Alrighty, cool. Well, gentlemen, those were my questions. So I'm gonna.
Couple minutes left.
Oh, sorry, ignore Joey. So I'm going to turn it over to the writers. Let's see here. Gerald asks, may I please ask your thoughts about turning a feature script into a TV pilot? Is that a good idea, hedging one's bets, or bad?
Go ahead.
Sure. I think it depends on what you want to be doing as a writer. If you are dead set on being a feature writer and that's the world you want to work in and you want to write movies and get them made, then there's nothing wrong with, sticking with features. You don't have to do a bit of everything. But if you do want to branch out into TV as well, then, and you know that you have a feature idea or a feature script that's already proven that people like, then I don't see any harm in trying to adapt that to TV. I think it's just a matter of the process of doing that. I wouldn't just take the first act of your feature and say, this is my pilot, because that's not exactly how TV pilots work. It needs to be a bit more of a self-contained thing that's, there's a lot more to it than just kind of like pulling, I'll take the start of my story and now it's a TV episode.
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to say the counterexample. I know a friend of mine who transformed his 2 features into TV pilots by taking the first act of his features. But that's it. It worked out fine. It actually worked out fine. But there was some tweaking involved. I want to say that's like the magic pill. But to your point, it is true that if you want to be a TV writer, that's quite different from being a feature writer. So if you, in terms of translating a feature into TV, I think the biggest question is, does that pilot, or does that concept have legs beyond the feature? Because whenever I think of ideas for features, usually they're pretty self-contained. So if you're translating even that first act of a pilot, does that just mean you're going to have 2 more episodes to that pilot or to that show? Or is it actually going to be a 100-episode long arc? Now, that's not to say you can't write a more self-contained show, right? You don't need to write a generative log line that can generate 100 episodes, but it's still worthwhile to look at the viability, the forward momentum of that series past the pilot.
Right. There are some ideas that just feel very suited to being told in a feature format. They often have kind of closed story and character arcs. The character starts in one place, ends up in another place, and that's the end of the story. Whereas TV has more of that ongoing feel to it, that the conflicts are never quite resolved, the characters never quite change fully, they're always dealing with something. And so, like Alex said, is there enough in that idea and those characters particularly, we say all the time on the podcast that TV is a characters meeting. Are your characters compelling enough for people to want to tune in each week and spend that time with them in their living room? All of that. So there's a bunch of those bigger picture questions to consider before you even get down to the nitty gritty of turning it into a pilot script.
Yeah, to your point, I feel like the key difference is that by and large, movies are story based, whereas TV is character based. So the story can have legs in terms of that 90-minute feature, but do the characters, right? Because if you're writing a good feature, then theoretically your character is going to go through a change in those 90 minutes. Now, is it possible to extend that journey through 100 episodes? Perhaps, but is that treading water? Is that a legitimate journey that we would want to embark on? Those are questions you got to ask yourself when you're translating that feature into a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Alrighty. I suppose sort of a similar topic question. What are your thoughts on trying to break into TV? If you don't have any TV credits, and how many samples do you need? Are the odds stacked against you? Do you have to be in LA? That sort of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think TV is having a new golden age, and I think that a lot of people are very keen to get into TV and work in TV. It's what they call peak TV right now. There's something like 650, 750 series on the air across all the networks. So, I wouldn't say it's a bad time to be wanting to work in TV, but there certainly is a lot of competition. There are a lot of people wanting to get into that, not only newer aspiring writers, but also people who have traditionally been working in feature writing or playwriting or things like that. They're all wanting to kind of branch in and get into TV as well. So, it's certainly not a bad idea, especially if it's something that you're passionate about and you want to live that life. I mean, it's important to note that it's kind of a different career, job style and career than being a feature writer. It really is around being in a writer's room with people for 50, 60 hours a week and following that entire production process all the way through a TV series and multiple seasons and all that kind of thing. Whereas a feature writer, you can kind of do this more assignment type work where you go in and do rewrites and you're done after 3 weeks, or you churn out one feature and then you sell it or you option it or something, and then you're done and you're on to the next thing. It's a different kind of way of living and working.
Yeah, I mean, feature writing is essentially akin to, being a novelist in a way, whereas doing a TV work is, like you mentioned, very socially heavy. So I think if you're more of a introvert, I think TV may not be the right place. But again, you can break those barriers. Now, in terms of breaking in and starting out in TV, especially in that peak era TV, in my mind, there's sort of like 3 elements you got to watch out for when you're starting out. One is your samples. So you do need samples, obviously. I would argue that pilots are probably more popular than specs. However, writing specs of existing shows, so those are essentially fake episodes of existing shows, are not just worthwhile for the fellowships. There's different fellowships program asking for those spec samples, but writing a spec episode is very useful in terms of a training ground, because in the writer's room, when you're staffed, you're not going to be coming up with original ideas like a pilot, right? You're going to be coming up with ideas for an existing framework of a show. So that's essentially akin to generating a spec script. So having samples like a pilot, multiple pilots hopefully, and a spec is really worthwhile. So that's the writing side. On the industry side, I wouldn't contend that you probably need to get some kind of industry related job, at least initially, just to get to know people and meet, because this industry, for better or for worse, is all about connections. So maybe you don't need to get a job to meet those people, but it definitely helps. So if you're getting a PA job or some kind of assistant work somewhere, even if it's at an agency, you can learn the ground, but also learn all the people around it. And the third element, sorry, I just want to finish. The third element, which in my mind is also sort of undervalued, is this idea of branding yourself, or who you are as a writer. That's this whole idea of being diverse. Now, in terms of the writing of it all, a lot of that diversity comes through who you are as a person, as a human being, and your voice on the page. So I feel like that's also an element that's underutilized by a lot of people, is they can put themselves out there and answer the question of what makes them unique above everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to expand on a couple of those points, I'll say with your samples, it helps to and along with branding as well, find your niche early on and make sure you have multiple samples in the same arena. They don't have to be exactly the same. They don't both have to be network multicams with slightly different ideas. One could be a network family single cam comedy, and one could be let's say a cable comedy that's a little bit more raunchy or something like that. But you're doing half-hour comedy scripts, and you're like, I want to be a TV comedy writer. As opposed to having one of those and then a sci-fi genre hour-long pilot and then a rom-com feature and then this and that. Like, you'd want to really focus your efforts and present a united front about what kind of writer you are and then what people can be hiring you for.
Yeah, just to quickly add on what you're saying, especially in TV, I feel like a lot of people forget that TV is a very structural medium. It's unlike feature, where in features, you could say there's a 3-act structure, but it's not really, it's kind of up to the writer to figure out what that structure of that feature is. In TV, there's an actual structure, right? If you work on an ABC show or an NBC show, you're going to have a structure. You're going to have this amount of real estate and these amount of acts to tell your story. So it's very structured. What that means is writing a half-hour show, writing a Brooklyn Nine-Nine is very different structurally from writing a 24 or a Lost or whatever, a Breaking Bad or a Better Call Saul. Those are very different formats. So familiarizing with and sort of deciding what your major is, so to speak, if you're a TV comedy writer or if you're a TV drama writer, is very important from the get-go.
Yeah, and it just helps people to know that you understand how those formats work and that you can do that work if they were to hire you in a writer's room or something like that. You may try to break into TV with a feature sample, but at some point they're going to want to read a TV pilot from you or a spec at least or something like that to know that you can write TV. So making sure that you have that. And it's not to say that you can't use other samples to impress people. There are a lot of like theater writers and they'll read a play and be like, wow, I really love your writing. But at some point you will have to write a TV episode and it should probably be before you're in the writer's room.
Yeah, and I would also say that if you're in between still and you do want to work in both half-hour and 1 hour, it's easier to transition once you're established in one domain than trying to break in both domains at once from the get-go. So people like Gene Espenson or Liz Sarnoff are people who've written for both half-hour and 1 hour shows. But when they transitioned out of their current frame, they were already established. They already had success in that other genre. So especially when you're first starting out, like Nick said, you got to brand yourself. You got to figure out who you are and what kind of writer you are.
Yeah. And then to your second point of meeting people and networking, it's not to say that you have to live in LA or you have to like throw everything away and move out here right away, but it'll just make it more difficult for you if you're not at least able to fly out here for a week or two and go to some networking events and meet people and be introduced to executives and things like that. And there are a number of ways that you can now reach out online and, TV, Facebook writing groups and Twitter chats and online pitch sessions and all that kind of thing. So there are ways to branch out here, but at some point you're probably gonna have to get your boots on the ground in LA and do a little bit of networking to really establish yourself.
Especially in TV. I feel like in feature, you could make the case that you can be anywhere as long as you sell that feature. In TV, the writers' rooms are physically in LA. Some of them are in New York, but that's only a handful of them. 90% of the rooms are in LA. So you have to be physically present to be in the writers' room and be pitching and helping with stories. So unless you're literally selling pilots, by and large, you're going to have to be in LA to work in the writers' room.
Cool. I love it. All right. Well, here's a really interesting question. So this is talking about quote unquote disposable characters or characters who die in a show, I suppose. The writer specifically mentions Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead. So he wants to know, is this something that writers argue and discuss whether the character should stay or go? Or is it kind of a logistical scheduling thing? Maybe the actor gets a movie and they have to leave, or maybe a combination of both.
Yeah, I mean, from my personal experience and from my friends who work on similar shows, I would say all of the above. It is both. Sometimes it is about the actor's availability, and sometimes it is about the character's journey. I would argue that when characters are killed, by and large, and when their stories end, is when their stories end, meaning their journey is over. They've accomplished whatever arc they've done. Now, it is true that, well, Game of Thrones is based on my books. It's slightly different, and Walking Dead also. But by and large, deaths are meant to stir the pot, but also to sort of heighten the emotion of the other characters in that environment. It's not just about, killing someone just for the spite of it. It's also about bringing up, the stories to tell for these other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that those kind of deaths are never just done at random. No writer's like, oh, I'm sick of writing for this character, let's just kill him. Like Alex said, sometimes there are like production scheduling things. The actor wants to leave and go off on a show, and so they kill off the character. But by and large, I think it's usually pretty well planned out that this character is going to be concluding their story at this point, and it does really have an impact and a meaning on the rest of the story and the characters. They're not disposable, as it said.
Yeah, and I will say that maybe on serialized shows especially, you sort of know the natural conclusion of certain characters. So whenever those characters are introduced, maybe even in an anthology type setting, you know from the get-go that person has only limited lifespan in terms of the narrative real estate. That said, if it's an ongoing character, in the rooms, people do debate, obviously, because people get attached. Some people get attached, some writers get attached to certain characters and others not so much. So, a room is essentially a micro version of a fandom of their shows. Like all the writers care about their show as much as the fans do, perhaps even more so, because, they're in that room talking about that show for 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. So they need to care about those characters and need to care about the stories. So yeah, of course, people are going to be debating heartily about, saving certain people.
Yeah, and I'd say if it's something that you're planning on putting into your own writing, just to be wary of doing that in a pilot, unless it's very particularly calculated. You want your pilot to be a reflection of what every week of your show is going to be. It's this same or similar cast of characters, and you understand the dynamics and the plot and how things are going to be working out. So if you kill your main character at the end of the pilot, I think it's going to lead to more confusion than it is to mystery and intrigue. And we're not going to know what the next episode looks like, so we're not necessarily going to want to read on and buy your show and find out how that all goes.
Unless you're rebooting 6 Feet Under and every episode starts with a death. But besides
that's
that,
more of an inciting incident.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Oh, I love it. All right, cool. So Anthony McBride asks, how hard is it to sell that first pilot without being in the writer's room? Anthony, do you mean sell as in just, sign it away, here, other showrunner, take my pilot and make a show? Or are you talking about you being the showrunner?
I mean, I can try to answer for the...
maybe let's go ahead and answer both.
Well, yeah, so in terms of selling a pilot itself, I would say almost impossible. The vast majority of people who sell TV shows to networks and get developed and make a pilot, and then if the pilot goes well, it gets turned into a series, they are all proven writers, especially in TV. A lot of people don't even start doing development until they're on their second or third show, where they've had a few years in the room. They understand that they've built those relationships with the executives and the development people that they're going to be working with. It's a very rare story for a spec pilot to come out of the ether from somewhere and get sold. Now, that's not to say it hasn't happened before. Mickey Fisher is a great example of that, where he just had an incredible pilot and there was a lot of interest in it. And so that kind of thing does happen once in a blue moon. But by and large, the majority of show creators who sell stuff and it goes on to be successful have been working writers for a while.
Yeah, I would say there are maybe two types of exceptions in terms of selling a pilot if you're not on staff or a high level person. One is if you have amazing attachments. So maybe you have an amazing actor or an amazing director, an amazing producer, or an amazing showrunner attached to that project. Mickey Fisher got his pilot extent bought by CBS in part because Amblin and Steven Spielberg were attached to that pilot when they read it. So it's not just out of the ether of Mickey Fisher's writing. It's also because of all these people involved. The second alternative is if that person is successful in another field. So, Nick, who did True Detective, was, a novelist. And so you have those people. David Simon, of course, was a journalist before he worked on Homicide. So you have those people who are successful in other fields and can parlay that and parlay sometimes their IP into selling a pilot and transition that way.
All right, cool. Sorry, guys, there's a plane overhead.
I will say as well, you mentioned being a showrunner after selling a show. That's also fairly uncommon, maybe even more so uncommon than selling a pilot out of nowhere. Once, most creators get to be sort of co-executive producers or maybe executive producers, and they are then paired up, as we mentioned earlier, with an experienced showrunner who has that production experience and will be running the room for them. So yeah, you get a sweet cushy job. You get to be the creator of a show and you get your name in the credits and all that kind of thing. But I can barely think of anyone who was allowed to run their own show after first selling. Maybe Phil Rosenthal and Everybody Loves Raymond. It was a weird exception to that.
I mean, by and large, the reason why that is because, as I mentioned earlier, being a showrunner is essentially being a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. So they're not going to hand over like a random person the keys to, this multi-million-dollar company. When I think of examples of people who sold pilots out of nowhere and shows out of nowhere, I think of, Josh Schwartz, who sold the OC when he was barely out of USC, but then he had Mac G attached and he was, a big producer of that show. So even, someone who's selling that show, and I think Mickey Fisher was not the showrunner of the first season, maybe the second season, but initially, like you brought up, they're going to be bringing that experienced showrunner, that experienced producer to work the room.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. Let's see. We have a question from Jerry. Is there an absolute no-no that will get a new writer asked to leave or fired, other than typical HR fireable offenses?
Right.
That's like within the writer's room, yeah? Yeah.
Showing up naked? No.
I'd say handing your scripts in late, like not meeting your deadlines. There really is no extension or late pass, or it's not college. Like you hand your scripts in on time and get your stuff done. Otherwise, I think that you probably won't be asked back, or you'll have your contract kind of terminated.
Yeah, I would also say not being socially aware about the room etiquette. So, for example, if you're in a room where you are expected to contribute and you're not talking at all for 5 days a week, then you won't be asked back because you're not contributing. On the flip side, if you're the kind of person who keeps talking and interrupting people and just wants to get your ideas across, even though nobody else is listening, or you're shutting down other people's ideas and not really contributing, then probably, again, you're going to be showing a negative experience in the room.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for writers to either lose their jobs or not be asked back for the next season, not because they're a bad writer, just because they're not a good fit for the show. And that may be a social thing, that they don't quite get along with everyone, or they're not on the same vibe or wavelength as everyone else when they're breaking these stories, and they just don't understand the show, and they're not kind of meeting the expectations of that. It's a relatively common thing in the industry for it just not to be a great fit. And sometimes there's not even any bad blood there. It's just like, you're just not right for this show, and we're going to bring in someone else who is.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify again what that could be, but it usually comes down to you're not a right fit socially with the rest of the room. It's not really the way we break stories. You come from a different type of breaking stories, or
you're not hitting the mark with your scripts.
Exactly.
What was expected of you, so things like that. But I'd say that people are pretty forgiving of lower level writers, and they understand that it's a learning experience for you. You're not going to say a special word or sit in the wrong person's chair and then they're going to fire you or something like that.
Yeah, the other small sort of exception I'll mention briefly is some people are not brought back on a staff writer level because of budgetary reason, and that's especially true for the diversity hires. I mentioned earlier the diversity programs, especially programs like ABC, pay for the writer to be in the room for that whole season, and so it's no money off the table for the EPs. So they kind of get a free person in the room. And so sometimes when that season wraps up, well, that money runs out. And so they'll hire that person back, but sometimes not. So,
yeah. And it's increasingly common for usually in a room, when you start off, you kind of move up a level each year. That's very rough. Sometimes it's 2 years, but it's very common these days for a staff writer to have to kind of repeat that year level twice. They do staff writer on one show, and they go to another show, they do staff writer again, and then maybe they get promoted to story editor the next year.
Right.
So
absolutely.
All right, cool. I have a question here. Let's see here. Are there rooms that really gel and play well? Blah, blah, blah. I have not had enough coffee, gentlemen. I'm sorry. Are there rooms that really gel and play well together? They work well. Things are going great. And then on the flip side, are there other rooms that are really cutthroat and competitive and just kind of a harsh environment to be in?
Yeah, absolutely. It really, again, to me, it comes down to the way the showrunner sets the tempo. Some showrunners are more ruthless and let the room be, this Game of Thrones like environment. But I feel like for most people, at least from my own experience, I've come across really good people. So I've been fortunate enough not to be in those environments. That said, I do know, I have friends who have worked in those terrible environments, and it's really hard to to get out of those environments.
Right. Yeah. There's always the horror stories of those, those kind of workplace environments where you don't ever feel safe to express your ideas, or you're constantly being criticized. And whether that's coming from up high or someone at your level or whatever it happens to be, there are definitely rooms where people don't have a good time. And that obviously sucks. And, you got to find a way around that and find what works for you. And I think over the course of your career, you're probably going to run into rooms that are great and they gel well and everyone's best friends, and rooms where it is a little more hectic like that. So it's just something to kind of expect, that when this many different personalities and creatives with different visions come together, there are going to be clashes, and then there are going to be people who are just like, peas in a pod.
Yeah, it depends on the egos in the room. Generally speaking, the first few weeks in a new writer's room is going to be kind of like the honeymoon period. So everyone, thinks they're getting along perfectly. They're going to be best friends forever. They're going to be, my best man at my wedding kind of thing. But then, a month in, 2 months in, 3 months in, you realize, holy crap, this is, when the deadlines hit, that's when things get tough, and usually when deadlines hit, that's when some writers are out of the room, some writers are in the room. It's kind of all over the place. So that's usually when you get to see sort of like the real makeup of the room.
Yeah, I mean, writers' rooms can get very stressful. You're on deadlines. You're trying to come up with ideas. You've gone through a million different iterations of things. You're staying late at night, so that's just another way, I guess, that like rooms could be more conflict driven, or a less good experience for people, is that they're forced to stay very late and keep writing new versions of the script and all that kind of thing, even if they get along well with the people in the room. So those kind of conditions are going to make anyone, yell at each other eventually, all that kind of thing. It's like, when you go on a holiday with your best friend, or you move in with your significant other after just seeing each other for dates, and it's like, oh no, now I really understand what it's like to be with this person.
Right, but I feel like, again, it comes back to the showrunner and the people in charge, right? If the showrunner is forcing you to stay until like 2 a.m. every night, that problem is probably with the showrunner. It's not with the show. It's not with the other people in the room. It's with the showrunner that's creating that atmosphere. On the other side, if you're in an environment with backstabby people and the showrunner is aware of that, then by definition, they're allowing that behavior by not firing those people. So again, it's like this weird balancing act where if you're below, a certain level, you don't want to, make waves, but it's hard not to make waves without, learning the politics of the room.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that some of that behavior sometimes gets a free pass because it is the creative world, and it's like, oh, that guy's really mean and stressful and whatever, but he's a genius or something like that. But what's the book, Difficult Men or something like that, about showrunners? But we think at least that shouldn't be the norm, and
no, it's not.
Everyone should treat each other like human beings,
yeah,
regardless of how brilliant you are at your job.
Absolutely, and I feel like it's not the norm, or at least personally, again, it's like moving towards a better place, at least from my own experience, and then the people I know.
Yeah, cool. So no more allowing assholes if they're brilliant.
Yes. Exactly.
All right, so we have a question here. During Blue Lightning, is the new writer allowed to add their thoughts? Was it Blue Lightning?
Blue Skying, maybe is what we're talking about.
Blue Skying, okay.
Blue
I thought
Skying.
so. Just wanted to check.
He wasn't autocorrected.
Yeah. In terms of blue skying, usually, again, it's the you're in the writer's room, and the creator, that's usually at the beginning of the season. So the creator or the showrunner is going to be in the room, initially pitching what the overall, arc or framework of the season is going to be. But that's a very loose framework. So 9 times out of 10, everyone in the room is meant to contribute to that and build, the sky and the skyline of what that show is going to look like on a more granular basis.
Yeah, in my experience, it was very welcome for newer writers to be pitching out these big ideas, just because it is kind of like there was really no stakes at this point. It's not like we're on a deadline and we need to solve this story problem. It's just like, what do you think would be cool for to happen in this show? And that's why they bring in these different writers, and that's why they hired you in particular, because they think you have good ideas. Even if this is your first staffing job, you won out over 200 other people that they were interviewing. So, they do want to hear from you when it is that kind of free-flow environment.
Yeah, and that's why blue skying is dangerous sometimes. sometimes because it's kind of like that research phase before you're writing a script, where you can research your script for like decades. And blue skying can take forever, but it's at the end of the day, if you're not getting something out of it after a few weeks, it's essentially procrastination. Really, that work and that effort is going to be put in initially, but then by week 3, it's time to get down and gritty in terms of the season arc and the character arcs.
Alrighty, cool. Well, gentlemen, those were the questions the writers had submitted. Writers, I don't know if you had been thinking of any more and biting your nails about how best to ask that question, but you should ask it now. Now would be the time. And we'll give you just a moment. So while we're letting them do that, would you gentlemen like to tell us a little bit about your podcast and where we might all go to find it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been doing a podcast, which is why we have this equipment here in front of us, called PaperTeam.
Let me get some business cards. Hold on a second.
We've been doing this podcast for over 2 years now. We just had our 100th episode, which we did a big live event for at a theater. Thank you. Yeah. We have had 2, there you go, PaperTeam. We have had 2 live WonderCon panels out in Anaheim, which have always been a packed house, and we've had some really great panelists and guests on those. So we kind of started this podcast, out of a feeling of what do we wish that we knew when we were starting out as writers, when we're both immigrants. I'm from Australia. My accent's literally got away, as I said, but from France. And we're like, I wish I knew all of this stuff before I got here and had to find it from a million different places. So we wanted to kind of put that all in one place and show people what it's like realistically these days to break into the industry, because we kept hearing so many stories from experienced writers that are 30 years old, stories that are 30 years old from like, I mailed in my hard copy of a Star Trek spec to the Star Trek writers room and they read it and they gave me a job. And it's like, well, that's great for you, but that doesn't just happen anymore. So
yeah, hold on. Let me time travel back to the 90s and get a job.
Yeah. So we really just wanted to give people, aspiring writers and, other people alike, the tools and the knowledge needed to get their feet on the ground in the industry and start networking and start working on their craft and understanding the business and how they can do what we did.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, my plan worked. We have a new question that appeared. So somebody has asked, what kind of progress are you seeing on the diversity front in writers' rooms?
Well, I mean, for my show, my room was very diverse. Sometimes, depending on when writers were out of the room, I was the only guy in the room. I mean, again, it depends on the showrunner. At the end of the day, that's if the showrunner and these people up top not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. I think that's when change is happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that because of the way the industry has been for so many years, that the people who are the higher level writers and the showrunners are by and large, older white men. And then so they know a bunch of other older white men and they put them all in a room together. And so we're lacking that diversity of voices and experiences and the kind of things that are, really useful to a writer's room. And now we are seeing a more of an influx at those lower levels, but it's going to take a little while for them to work their way up the ranks and then get to those showrunner positions and start hiring more diverse there as well. So there have been a number of great initiatives like the fellowships and the diversity programs and all of that kind of thing. But, like Alex said, it really does come down to the showrunner and who they're making the hiring decisions on. But, I can speak from personal experience. My writing partner, Kelly D'Angelo, she's a Native American woman, and I was in a pretty smallish room for final space, and another one of our guys, our writers, Cam, was African American, and our writer's assistant was a woman. And so it's honestly just such a great environment to have that diversity of perspectives and different experiences and voices in there to contribute to something that, particularly in terms of representation, makes people feel like they're being seen on screen. We're representing diversity of race and gender and sexual identity and things like that. And we've seen a lot with feature films these days that it's so important for people to see that and see that reflected back at them.
I always feel like it's incumbent upon the producers and the EPs to make the room match what the show is. If hopefully the show is diverse, so why not make the room equally as diverse as the show? To me, that's maddening not to do that because you do want those voices in the room. They'll be the ones able to talk about their own experiences in a way that other people cannot.
Yeah, so I think that we are making progress. Maybe it's a little slower than we'd like, but I think we'll get there in the next little while.
Yeah. I mean, you can only speak, through our own personal experiences, not something we.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, I'm getting a lot of messages from the writers going, this was great. Thank you so much. So I don't know if they have any more questions or if you have filled their brains with so much knowledge. They're so excited to get out there and tackle this. Okay, Mike, I see that you put something in the chat. I'm going to accept it this one time, but Q&A box next time, all right? What would be a...
Playing again.
Is that playing?
Sorry, I think there's... I'm not entirely sure. I'm convinced there's a military base around here somewhere, and they do flight training all the time. Anyway, back to topic at hand. So Mike asks, what would be a good current sci-fi show to spec?
That's my specialty. Let's see. A good current show to spec. I always think of specs as what show has longevity, but also has stories to tell and matches your current, your current samples. So there's different kinds of sci-fi shows I felt right now would be good. Obviously, most CW shows would be, a pretty secure choice. Obviously, I mean, I don't know if I would call them sci-fi, but they're definitely genre heavy. That's more on the procedural end. I feel like The Expanse actually would be a really interesting show to spec because it just got picked up by Amazon. It's getting a lot of traction right now. The downside is it's very, very, very serialized and it's based on books. So that may not be accepted depending on the fellowship. So that's something you got to watch out for.
On the flip side from that, and Alex may disagree with me because he is the spec expert, but I think that perhaps it's a little overdone, but Black Mirror is an interesting one to write a spec for because although it has certain elements that tie it into the voice of this show and whatever, it is a self-contained anthology thing. And so you can really tell your own little short story, just making sure you're touching on those themes of technology and humanity and how that all kind of intersect.
Yeah, Black Mirror is actually a good choice. I personally consider it cheating because you're basically writing a pilot. You're writing a standalone feature or standalone story in that spec. So I would argue it doesn't really reflect the point of a spec, which is writing a sample episode of an existing show, and Black Mirror is an anthology. However, with all that said, Nick is correct in saying that Black Mirror is actually a good choice, assuming the fellowship in question does accept that show.
Right, you can make it memorable. I think is important.
Right.
So
absolutely.
All right. Well, cool. I don't see anything else either in the Q&A or in the chat. Mike says sorry, so I'll accept your apology, Mike. Alrighty, cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. I should say you can check out our podcast, Paper Team, at www.paperteam.co.
And it's available on all the platforms.
So
yeah, no, go check it out, guys. If you like what you heard here, look them up. Alrighty, well, I'm going to let you all go. Have a great rest of your Sunday or possibly very early Monday morning. I think I have some international folks listening in. They're crazy brave. Go off. Have a great rest of your day, night, whatever it is, and I will see you all in the next one.
All right.
Bye, guys.
See you guys.